Hello, everyone. How is everyone doing? Welcome to Film Scanning in the Modern Era. We're going to be talking today, of course, about film digitization using more modern systems and scanners. And we'll give people a couple of minutes to join. So I was about to ask, where's everybody from? We've got, oh, great. So we got some folks from Europe, all over the United States. Excellent, excellent. Berlin, Canada. Okay, great. The UK. Wonderful. Well, thank you to the European audience for staying up late. And oh, wow, New Zealand too. Okay. I don't even know what time it is over there. So I assume it's not super convenient though. So yeah, we'll give folks another minute to hop on. But thank you all for joining. This presentation is going to be a little bit, informal. I'll run through some of the hardware and the workflow and then the post-processing, but I'm also going to start off with a few polls, and I want to find out a little bit more about you guys and what you're interested in hearing about. So we'll just give folks a little bit more leeway. Ooh, 7:30 a.m. in New Zealand. Okay. Not great, but not terrible. So thank you for waking up early to join us. All right. So now that we've got folks in the audience, I'm going to start off with a couple of introductions. The usual. I'm sure many of you have been to our webinars before. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Arnab Chatterjee. I'm a technical specialist. I'm working here out of the New York office, and I'm based in Brooklyn. We are back in the office on like a limited schedule, of course, social distancing, and we're available for support, remote demos, and whatever it is that you need. We are here. Carson is going to be helping out in the chat on that side, I think. And he is part of the marketing and events department. And so if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll save them until the end, and then Carson will mark them, and we'll go through them all at once in a Q&A at the end. A little bit about DT. Again, I'm not going to take a long time on this. We started out as a commercial photography company selling the highest end, camera equipment to, conventional photographers. A lot of our clients ended up being museum and library and archive and gallery photographers though. And so we took the time to expand and build products specifically for the cultural heritage world. We also had some, I'll skip over some scientific applications, some industrial applications come in, and we do custom work for those. And most recently, and this is actually relatively applicable to today's webinar, we partnered with our, a company that was a client of ours called Pixel Acuity, and they perform digitization service work using the equipment that you're going to see today, and some of the workflow and post-processing capabilities that we have. They've actually really expanded on with, everything from, custom hardware to AI. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. But we're located on both coasts. We have staff working remotely all over the United States. Like I said, our center is open here in New York City by appointment. So if you're interested in coming by, you feel safe doing that, you can always come in, schedule an appointment. If you'd like to do a remote demo, we can do those as well. So anywhere in the world, comfort of your own home, just let us know. We have a few websites here, but I think we'll hop into that. You know where to find us online. And here we go with our webinar. So as I mentioned, and for those of you that are just joining, I want to start off with a couple of polls here. And the first one here is, why are you interested in digitizing film? And I've given like 4 options here. I know that there, any number of reasons that there can be, but, for those, we're talking about preserving cultural heritage. So that would be, if you're a professional in the museum, gallery, library, or archive community. If you're a professional photographer, or if you have a large body of work that you'd like to digitize, that's sort of the second option there. If you're a hobbyist photographer like me, you know, I like to shoot film and I like to digitize my film on this stuff here too, which is very handy, perk of working at DT. And then preserving family archives. You know, if you have a collection of film, you know, personal family material, or, you know, anything that's precious to you that maybe you didn't shoot but you want to preserve. Okay, great. So I'm seeing that about 60% of the audience is from the cultural heritage world, which is great. And then about 25%, just rounding here, is from, you know, professional photographers looking to learn more about digitizing their collections. And then the last 10% or so, you know, give or take, are either hobbyist photographers or folks looking to digitize their family archives. So I'll try and tailor my presentation a little bit to, you know, what folks are interested in here. I also wanted to ask a couple of other things. So if you're already digitizing film, what solution are you currently using? You know, if you have multiple solutions, what's the most, you know, common one that you use? You know, is it a phase one or, you know, digital transition system like this guy here? Is it a digital camera? You know, whether it's a phase one XF or, you know, a Nikon or a Sony or whatever, you know, we don't discriminate here. We want to know that. And then if you're using a drum scanner or an Imicon, that's the other option. And then flatbed scanner, which again is a very great low cost option. We'll talk about kind of the pros and cons of all these things, but that's great. Okay, so we've got about 30, 30, 30 using phase one, other digital cameras, and flatbed scanners. And then the other 10% are using drum scanners or virtual drum scanners, being Imicons or Flextites. So that's good to know. And then the last question that I want to start out with here is, what are you most interested in hearing about? You know, there are three kind of things that we can focus on, and we'll touch on them all. But the first would be the hardware. So talking about what you need, what you might want, what you might be able to get away with without. The second would be the capture workflow, and I'm already seeing we've got, you know, majority of people wanting to learn about the capture workflow. And that would just be, you know, okay, great, I've got my hardware set up. What the heck do I do, right? How do I get my images into a usable state where I can start doing the post-processing on them? And that would be doing things like making exposure adjustments, color corrections, negative conversion, color profiling, that sort of stuff. So it's looking like half of the folks on the webinar are really interested in the capture workflow, about 30% in post-processing, and then 20% on hardware. So here's what we'll do. We'll start on the hardware just to kind of give you the quick rundown of what you need. We'll take some more time on the workflow and kind of going through all that, you know, we need to do to make sure we're getting really high quality images out of our system, whatever that may be. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the post-processing, okay? So I've got a couple of cameras set up right now. This is the me camera, but I also have one that is directed chat here. And it's going to be a little confusing for me, but I'm going to talk to you guys over here. And can everybody see, Carson, could you just chime in and make sure, you know, can you see me, hear me okay with this webcam? Excellent. Okay. And by the way, if you have questions, and I'm looking over this way because that's where my laptop is, sorry. If you have questions as I'm talking about things, do throw them in the chat. Carson will be marking those for later, and we'll address them at the end. So
Arnab, I think,
when it comes to digitizing,
I think maybe if you talk a little louder so we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, let's see. Okay, how about this? Is this better?
Yeah, that's,
even if I'm a little further away?
that's a little better.
Okay, great. So I'll see if I can sit a little bit closer here. But effectively today, what we're talking about are instant capture systems. And so instant capture systems are going to be effectively digital camera-based systems. The alternative would be a scanner, which has a single line that moves across a piece of film or an image, whatever you're looking to digitize. There are various advantages and disadvantages to the different methods. You know, scanners achieve sort of the same resolution regardless of the size of the object. One of the things, though, that really kind of hampers scanners is that nobody really kept developing them after film kind of went away and digital supplanted it. So I won't be talking too much about scanners. There's great stuff out there if you're working, you're attached to drum scanners or Imicons. They have a certain look and that's great. But definitely consider an instant capture system like this or working with a digital camera. And so the difference with an instant capture system is that we're working with an area array sensor, and that's going to be something, and you know what? I'll show you guys the goods here. So this here, oh yeah, you can't see anything in there, but there is a, let me see if I can swap it over here. Is a medium format 645 sensor inside of this body here. This body that I'm using today is called the Phase 1 IXH. It's a dedicated reprographic camera. There are plenty of digital cameras out there. There's the Phase 1 XF. There are cameras from Nikon and Sony. We'll talk about, again, the advantages and disadvantages of those. But this is what we're going to be using today. As you'll see, we'll take this guy and put it up on the copy stand here. And using that sensor, we're going to capture our entire image all at once, hence the instant capture name. We'll be using a shutter, a mechanical shutter, inside our lens in this case. And then we, if you have a different digital camera, the focal plane shutter, if you're using the Phase 1 XF, you'll also have, that as a possibility. But we'll be using the shutter in the lens here. And as we attach that, we're going to be doing everything all at once. So when I talk about the system here, I want to ask one last question. And that is, have you ever used an enlarger? Okay, so a vast majority of you have used an enlarger. For those of you that haven't used an enlarger, basically what an enlarger does is you take your piece of film, you put it in a carrier, you take a light at the top, it projects an image of that film that's focused through the lens onto a piece of paper that you would print that image onto. All right. The reason I ask is because what we're doing here is effectively an enlarger in reverse. So let's take a look at what we're working with here. So with an enlarger, we would start with a light source. In this case, our light source is a DT photon LED. So this is a light box that's designed specifically to have a high CRI and very even illumination. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the hardware because we're more interested in the capture. But one of the things that you really want to look for when you're looking at a light source is that it's uniform and that it's diffuse. And so you'll see that the actual LEDs are distributed in the bottom, and there's a lot of space for the light to come up and diffuse so that the pattern of the LED doesn't show inside our image, because that's not what we want to see. We want to see the image content itself. So there are a variety of solutions that you can use. But if you're looking at something like a viewing light box that's not designed specifically for digitization, a lot of times those will have an LED pattern that will show. There are some fun solutions that you can do using a cell phone. You want to make sure you have that far enough away so that you don't get the pixel pattern on there as well. And that's why, if you're doing something where you really want to have the best image quality, you want to find a dedicated solution. And we'll kind of revisit that throughout the hardware and the capture process. So in an enlarger, the next thing we need is something to hold our film in place. So this here is our custom film scanning top. And what this is going to do is it's going to receive these film holders that we have, And these film holders are very similar to Imicon holders, except they're solid aluminum. And they don't bend the film at all. And so what we'll do is we'll take this and we'll put it on top of our light here in this nice channel. And again, there's a little bit of lift on top of the light that makes sure that we don't have any of the pattern showing. And there's also a couple of slides in here, and you might be able to see it coming in and out on that end. And those are going to flag off the light so we don't get any flare into our lens. And of course, the lens is the next thing we want to talk about. And in this case, we're using, again, the IXH reprographic camera, and it has a 120 millimeter aspheric Schneider lens on there. And so that's a really, really high quality lens. You'll see that it's going to provide us really, really great resolution, and it's built directly in to work specifically with this camera. And I'll show you some of the cool integration features that we get by using that system. And then, of course, the last thing, which is the sort of analog to our paper in an Enlarger, is the digital sensor, right? So when we have our sensor, we're going to capture our image on that, and instead of putting it onto paper, we're going to link it back through into our computer here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to plug this all in. All right. The IXH connects via USB-C. And then we have a handy AC power supply here. So if you're doing a larger digitization project, the reason that you would want something like this is because with the AC power, you're not swapping out batteries. If you're doing something like, capturing many, many pieces of film a day, you want to make sure that you have a shutter that's going to last, and you want to make sure that you have a lens that isn't going to drift. Okay, so what I want to do right now is just show you the. Let's see. I'm going to pull up live view here. Or actually, one more thing. So I think somebody asked, I was just kind of glancing at the chat about whether I'm using an Arca-Swiss cube here, and the answer is absolutely. And going back to the Enlarger, and also somebody is mentioning keeping film perfectly flat, this doesn't relate specifically to the film being flat, but one thing to keep in mind is that everything in the system has to be absolutely parallel to keep everything in focus. When we're shooting film, it's going to be at extremely high magnification because the film itself is very small, and our sensors themselves are, relatively small, even if you're using a medium format. So unless you're doing like 8x10 or 16x20, you're going to be shooting at very high magnification, and your depth of field is going to be very, very narrow. So 3 things have to be parallel. Your film plane, and to Roman's point, your film also has to be very flat. But your film plane has to be parallel to your lens plane, and that also has to be parallel to your sensor plane. Now, if you're using a camera system like this, and honestly most modern camera systems, you don't really have to worry about the lens and the sensor being parallel. But we definitely have to worry about the parallelism of the bench to the camera itself. And this is something that I check every time I'm shooting, just because I'm absolutely paranoid. So the way that we check this is by using a laser leveling system. This is the cheapest filter we could find, and there's a little dot on there. And so what I do prior to imaging anything is I'll take my little laser level there, right? I'll pop the filter on there, and I've already leveled this, but basically what will happen is the laser will bounce up onto the filter here, and it'll bounce back down. And if everything is aligned, it should go right back into the center where it came from. But if it's off axis, then it'll bounce onto a different part, right? So if it's too far this way, the laser will bounce away from the dot. And that'll give me an idea of how far off I am and how far back I need to go. this is where ad hoc systems become a nightmare. As someone who had an old Nikon, a 200 macro lens, and a tripod that I could point down at a table, this is where it was just a disaster and it didn't work. Because getting that kind of parallelism at that high of magnification is just not possible. So a lot of times people ask, why do I need a dedicated system for this? Why would I spend, any amount of money doing this when I just have a digital camera that I can pop on there? And the answer is getting that kind of precision is really, really difficult. And just because you can technically do it using a less expensive system, you're going to save a lot of time. And your time is valuable, right? I'll talk a little bit more. Yeah, so the parallel system that we use is called the Parallel by VersaLab. I'll give you more information on that in a follow-up email. But good question. So it's a Parallel by VersaLab, and then we just bought a cheap filter because you just want to stick a dot on it, and you're just using that to make sure you have the top of the lens parallel, because the lens element is going to be curved on the front. All right. So I've talked enough, I think, about the hardware. We have our light box, we have our film holders, we have our lens, we have our sensor. We've paralleled everything. And now we're going to connect over to Capture One. The other thing that we need to note is if we're using a constant light source, that light source has to be the brightest thing in the room. And even if we're using a strobe, it still has to be the brightest thing in the room. It's just with a strobe, that's less of a problem. So what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to turn off the overhead lights. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Right. Nice dramatic dimming. You can see there is a little bit of a light leak on our window there. Obviously, that's not ideal. We would seal that off, but it's coming at an angle, so we're not going to worry about that right now. And I am going to go ahead and switch over to screen share. So let's see. Oops. Okay, Carson, can you see my screen? Carson? Yes.
Great.
Does it look good?
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. So like I said, I already went ahead and set things up regarding parallelism and the resolution, but let me show you a little bit what I would need to do to make sure I set my system up right. So there are a few different things that we're going to have to figure out when we do our capture. One is going to be our exposure. The other is going to be our resolution and our focus. And then the last one is going to be our light uniformity, right? So we can start with the resolution because that's going to tell us exactly where the camera is going to be positioned in space. And that's a pretty important thing to figure out first. So one of the things to keep in mind, and because we're using Capture One cultural heritage here, this is where using an integrated system that tells you all of these things. If I'm changing my focus, it tells me exactly what PPI I'm at. And I'm able to move my column up and down remotely. This is where an integrated system is going to save you a lot of time. If you're at an institution or if you're doing a lot of your own work professionally, it's going to save you a lot of money. If you don't have these tools, you'd be kind of like sitting, racking focus rings or moving, camera stands up and down and so on and so forth. Again, these things can be done, but I'm going to be showing you how we do it with the system here. So there's a couple of variables to keep in mind. The distance between your lens and your sensor is what sets your magnification ratio. And your magnification ratio will be what determines your resolution in terms of pixels per inch. So the only thing that I need to do to set my PPI is change my focus. And I don't know if you can, let me switch back. Carson, is my let me turn the lights back on. Is my video still up? Can you still see the camera?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Can you see it kind of like moving up and down?
Yes, slightly.
Okay. So what I'm doing when I'm focusing the camera, and I'm doing that remotely here, is I'm adjusting the distance between the lens and the sensor. And you're seeing that that is what's changing my PPI. So what I want to do is I want to set that to whatever value I need it to be. So in this case, I'm going to get it nice and close to 4,000. For those of you that are in the cultural heritage world, you know that 4,000 is FADGI 4-star resolution, if you can get it. Of course, the written resolution and your optical resolution are not always the same, and that's why we have targets, but we're not even going to touch that today. And so you'll see now that, okay, I've dialed in my resolution, but my image is fuzzy. So what's going on there? What's going on is that my plane of focus is not in the right place. So the way that I can move my plane of focus without changing the distance between my lens and my sensor is by changing the distance between my entire camera and the subject. And this is where the copy stand comes into play. So as I push the buttons on the copy stand, you can see that I can actually move the system up and down. And while I have my live view pulled up, I can zoom in to 100%. And if you'll bear with me, my computer is not very happy about running all of this stuff all at once. Okay, great. So we got the edge of our building here. And I'm going to turn off the lights again so you get a better contrast. And you'll see that as I adjust the position of my column, our image is going to come into nice sharp focus. And so what I've done there is I've just moved the camera position, but I've left the distance between the lens and the sensor the same. So this is going to be the first thing that you want to dial in when you're setting up a film digitization system, right? Now that I have that set, this is actually where I would level the camera. Again, I've already leveled it, but once I have the position and I know exactly where it's going to be, that's where I want to make sure it's set, and that way I never have to touch the camera again after I do this, right? So I'm going to zoom back out here. And now there are two other things that I said we have to look at. So one is going to be the overall exposure. And the second is going to be light uniformity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about light uniformity first. If you look at my system here, I'm effectively shooting straight down into a light box, right? And as long as that light box has perfectly even illumination from edge to edge, I don't have to worry about, some parts of my film being illuminated, better or worse, more brightly or, more dark than they should be. But it's not guaranteed. With the photon, it is guaranteed. But, if you're working with another light, there's still a step that you want to do, and that's called an LCC, and that stands for lens cast calibration. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to take my exposure and I'm just going to adjust it. I'm going to pick a value to kind of get myself a nice middle gray and a neutral value here. So you can see that I've shot my light box, and if I drop a couple of color pickers on here, just to show you what the values are, you can see that across all four corners of my image, am I already applying? Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so you can see that at this aperture, I'm basically within 1 point of lab value, lab being luminosity, red, green bias, and blue, yellow bias. And we can convert that to RGB, of course, just depending on which system you're more comfortable with. So I'm within a couple of RGB points here, just based on the light source. But if I were to have some major difference, I could use the LCC tool in Capture One. It's usually under the Lens tab. You can always add it here. And I can just hit Create LCC. and you'll see that the difference between the middle and the edge was 5 points, and it's gone to being the same. So effectively what that's doing is Capture One is saying, okay, Arnab has told me that these values should all be equal across the board. I'm going to make local adjustments to my entire image just to bring those within range, and then I'm going to take that light map that I effectively got from this exposure and use that on all of my following images. And that's something you can enable, disable, you can apply it in post because it's all raw, you're not destroying, you're not making any destructive edits. But that's something that you're going to want to use to create, make sure you have that uniform illumination. Now, how do I figure out what my exposure should be? Well, there are going to be 3 different things that we work with, similar to when we take any photo. And I'll put my film back on here. Put the light gates back up. And we'll just set that guy in there, right near the middle. Okay. So one thing about the system here is that we are working with a digital sensor, and if we go too far, we expose too high, we'll lose data, right? So we'll clip our highlights. The nice thing about a system like this is there's one thing that's always going to be the brightest object in any of our images, and that's the light box. So oftentimes what I can do is I can actually set my exposure based off the exposed parts of my light box. Now, what I'm using here on the IQ, I'm sorry, not the IQ4-150, it's the same sensor, but the IXH-150. This allows me to have exposure simulation. So you can see that as I adjust my shutter speed, I get a good idea of what's lighter and darker. And I'm just adjusting the exposure time. The other 2 variables here, which are your ISO and your aperture, are things that you're going to want to preset and not change. So your ISO, of course, you want to keep as low as possible, to your base ISO. You don't want to go below that, even though you can on some cameras. And that's going to make sure that you don't amplify any noise, that you get the cleanest possible signal coming in. For your aperture, this is something that's dependent on your lens and your sensor. Typically, just across the board, values between 8 and 11 are solid choices. If you're using a higher resolution camera, you can run into something called diffraction, which is where the cone of light that expands from any one point in your image becomes larger than your pixel size. You can run into softness in your images where you won't be taking full advantage of the resolution, and that comes at higher apertures. So we found that on the IQ4-150 sensor, the 150 megapixel sensor, sticking around f8 or f9 is usually the best way to go. If you're using another digital back or a different camera with larger pixels, you can usually go to 10 or 11, but that's not a huge deal. If you're in the range from 8 to 11, you're typically going to be fine. And then your shutter speed is what you're going to be using to adjust your exposure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do just a couple like guess and check exposures here. And as I capture my image, and again, the nice thing about instant capture is that I can just hit Command K and get a nice looking image. I'm going to delete my color readouts. I'm going to turn on my exposure warning, and you'll see that these sprockets light up because that's the light box coming through. There's nothing sitting between that and our sensor. And we don't want to be blowing out anything in our image. So this lets me know that I've exposed, too long. I'll cut down my exposure time. And I'm just going to bring it down until I don't see that. Okay, and this is one more thing that I should mention. So if you're using a phase 1 camera, you'll have a couple of different curve options in base characteristics. You'll see linear scientific being the one that you want to use for phase 1 cameras. For non-phase 1 cameras, you'll only have linear response. But effectively what those 2 things do is any camera, when you're capturing an image, just like sees the amount of light coming in. when our eyes see the amount of light coming in, they also apply some color bias and some contrast curves on there to make things appear the way that we see them. So when you take a raw image, it'll apply a curve to it, and typically that curve is this film standard contrast curve. We don't want it to do that though, because the film itself already has a curve built in. So we don't want to double that curve. We want to actually just capture the film as it is, as like a physical object. So we want to use a linear curve and make sure that we're not doubling or tripling up on that curve. And I'll explain that a little bit more in the processing section. But when we're capturing, we'll use linear scientific or linear response. And you'll see that actually, when I do that, because I'm not applying a heavy contrast curve to it, I can now actually increase my exposure and just make sure that I'm getting the best shadow detail by making the exposure as bright as possible without blowing my highlights. And so we see that 1/25th is too high, 1/30th is too high, and 1/40th is perfect. So that's how I determine my exposure, right? And now that I've captured my image, it's as simple as taking my live view, and I've got my film strip with 1, 2, 3, 4 images here. And I just want to make sure my light gates on the side are coming in and cutting out any stray light. I want to leave a little bit of room on each side, similar to the room that I see around the sprockets here, just to make sure I don't introduce any vignetting. And then all I'm going to do is go back up to 40th of a second, hit my capture button, and we'll move on to the next one. Hit capture again. On to the next one. Capture, I'll move it a little bit over. Sorry, the live view is running a little bit slower than usual because I have all the video stuff in the background. And then we'll get our last one on this strip here. A little more, okay. And we'll capture. Great. So now I have 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see, I didn't select this one. Okay, 4 images that I've captured. I'm just going to get rid of all of the other ones in that folder. And at this point, we're going to go into talking about processing, right? Because I've just captured these negatives, and now, that doesn't really give me any information. But now I want to take a moment to go back and talk and take a couple of questions about the capture, since I know that's where we had the most interest. So I'm going to stop the screen share here, and I'm going to pull up the questions. Okay, I'm going to sort them by oldest. Okay, and let's see. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so first question, what is the best way to focus with a manual focus lens? And that is a great question. Also, I'm going to turn the lights back on real quick. Using a manual focus lens is challenging, and I actually have one over here that I brought to illustrate. If you're touching the lens in any way, at that magnification, you're going to introduce very slight vibration that will make it hard to see if you're getting a sharp image. There is a focus check tool, though, in Capture One, and I'll show you that when we go back to the screen share. But basically, you can drop a zone, a little square, onto your image, your live view, and then you can use that to gauge how much contrast you have in that area. and it'll let you know when you've hit maximum contrast, and that's typically, you know, the point where you're in focus. So that's the best way to work with a manual lens. Got another question. So in the LCC calibration, are you looking for a value similar to 18% gray? That's a very good question. Typically, you want to have a middle gray, but it really doesn't matter for the LCC since your sensor has a linear response anyway. You don't want it to be super, super dark in the shadows, and you don't want it to be blown out or super, super high in the highlights. 18% gray is fine. 50% gray is fine. As long as you're staying kind of like towards the middle of your histogram, that's totally okay. Okay, we're asking about sharpening, negative mode, dual exposure plus. What is my exposure warning set to? Very good question. Yes, it is set to 255 because I am using linear scientific. And what linear scientific does is it says if the value goes above 255, we're going to assume that this guy knows what he's doing and just chop it off, right? If I'm using linear response, the difference between the two is that's going to give me like a nice little fall off curve, like a grace period almost after I hit 255, where it'll be like, okay, I don't think he wanted to blow that highlight, so we'll kind of give it, you know, a little bit of a curve and make sure it doesn't just absolutely crash. But that's why I set it to 255, because what I'm really interested in is maintaining the maximum amount of shadow detail and getting the most out of my dark areas of the film, which will lead to the highlights for a negative, or in the case of a transparency, the really, really high, you know, fine detail in the shadows, right? Why do I not use the histogram to set exposure to the right? That's a good question. You can, and you typically, you know, I use the exposure warning specifically because the only thing that I'm interested in is exactly when I hit that value of 255 at that one specific area, right? So right in my sprocket area, or if I'm shooting larger format film, I'll just take the film off if there aren't sprockets, like for sheet film, and look at the light box. So you can use your histogram for it, but when you're looking at an image, you really aren't interested in the actual histogram image contents. You're just interested in that spot with the sprocket or that part that's the light box. And just having the red indicator in Capture One makes it easier to kind of work with. So, okay. All right, so we've got a couple of questions about film resolution. I'm just going to kind of bundle these all together. So somebody was asking, why don't you fill the frame with the image to maximize resolution? Somebody else was asking, can we reach 9,000 DPI or 3 micron in 35 millimeter, I guess, film for tissues? And the answer is, if you throw enough extension on any lens, you can get it to where it theoretically hits 9,000 PPI. In terms of, if you have a perfect lens and a perfect sensor, based on where you put those things with the amount of extension you have, you should get a 9,000 PPI image. That said, you're going to be limited by the optics, right? So you have to have the world's best lens and the world's best sensor, right, in order to get that kind of you know, resolution. And so there are some targets that we use to measure resolution. Somebody, and I don't want to guess the name because I know I'm going to say it wrong, but somebody was asking if there are SFR targets to check PPI, and I may be getting too technical, but basically there are resolution targets that I can use to determine what my actual resolution I'm getting is. And typically the guidelines for, you know, federal agency digitization and for, you know, basically all the international bodies that say this is what the highest resolution images of film should be for archival purposes go to about 4,000. And that's where most targets stop. There are 35 millimeter targets that go up to about 8,000 and then 10,000 for microfilm targets. So those are available. So the answer is it's possible, but it becomes astronomically more difficult in terms of focusing. And then the final question is, what are you doing with this film, right? And that's a really important question to ask even before you start scanning. Because if I'm shooting, 15 rolls over, a summer vacation, I learned the hard way that I don't want to scan each and every frame at 8,000 or 4,000 PPI. Just because I can doesn't mean that I should. What I actually want to do in that case is shoot, a bunch of them set out on a plate to make a little contact sheet, figure out which ones I really want, and then go in and scan those at 4,000 PPI. The main thing to keep in mind is print size, right? So if you're doing it for preservation imaging, you go by the guidelines. If you're going for, artistic print work, then you just have to consider how high you're looking to go in terms of print size. So I can absolutely fill the frame with 35 millimeter. The reason that you're not seeing it fill the whole frame at 35 millimeter, even at 1:1, is because the sensor is larger than 35 millimeter. So if you're using a Nikon or a Sony or whatever, you would actually fill the frame at that size. But because we're using a medium format sensor, we're able to do things like 645 and sheet film at higher resolution. So you can go infinitely high in terms of resolution up to a certain diffraction limit, but the cost of the optics and the amount of precision that you have to have in your system in terms of stability, planarity, and just the ability to capture at that magnification becomes like well over hundreds of thousands of dollars for things at that level. So okay, I'm gonna just see if there may be one more question. Can you run an uncut film roll through your carrier? So for these particular carriers, you can't. We do have, though, some custom-built real film solutions that you can mount film onto. I believe we have a 35 millimeter film solution. And there it is. Thank you, Carson. And that one you see there is actually for aerial film. So, whether you're working with, 12 by 12 or 16 millimeter, you can get it done. All right. So now I'm going to go into the processing a little bit. And for this, I'm going to switch back to my screen share. Okay. All right. And Carson, just to confirm again, y'all can see my screen?
I can see it perfectly.
Excellent. Okay. So one of the nice things is I shot this roll, all at the same shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So for the most part, unless I have an image that's really underexposed or really overexposed, I can make my edits to one image and then just batch apply them to the rest of my roll, and that'll do a pretty good job. So because we decided we were going to shoot at 4,000 PPI, we didn't end up filling our frame. But if you look at the dimensions here, I still have a 24 megapixel image. In fact, I think it's a little bit more than that, 6,000 times 4,500 roughly. And so that's a pretty good sized image for, a print. If I wanted to make one, 8 by 10, even up to like, 1620. So obviously the first thing I need to do is I need to convert this image from a negative to positive. If you're working with Capture One Cultural Heritage, there is simply a mode where you switch from photography to film negative, and there you are, you're at a positive. If you're not working with Capture One Cultural Heritage, you're gonna have to do something a little bit more tricky, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and make a copy of this image, and we'll put them side by side just so you can see what the difference looks like. So on this one, I'm gonna go from film positive to film negative, And I'm just going to put a standard contrast curve on that. For this one way that you can go from a negative to a positive is just to do a direct inversion. So I want to invert that one. If you look at the difference between the two, you can see that film negative accounts for a lot of different things. It's not just taking the film histogram and flipping it, right? So the other things that you want to consider when you're looking at an image and you're going from film negative to film positive is you want to apply a contrast curve to it. So you actually want to be working in film standard. And then I gave a presentation on this a long time ago at a Cultural Heritage Roundtable. For those of you that were here last year, you might have seen it. If you look at the curve of film, the contrast curve of negative film itself, it actually looks something like that. And I know the image is looking crazy, but basically what it does is it absorbs light in a nonlinear way. And so to get an image that looks correct, if you're just inverting, you also have to account for that, right? So our image looks a little bit too flat here. And as we add a curve that sort of combats that, you'll see that it starts to look a little bit more normal. Now, this is relatively straightforward when it comes to monochrome film, black and white. It gets a lot messier with color, as I'll show you in a minute. The other advantage of using Capture One Cultural Heritage is if I'm working in large batches and I have to make adjustments to exposure, if I go up, it goes up. If I go down, it goes down. If I'm just working kind of like with my own methods, all my controls are inverted. So if I increase my exposure, it actually goes, becomes darker. If I decrease it, it becomes lighter. You can get used to it. But again, if you're working in an institutional setting or if you're doing this in any serious quantity, this is something where you want to have the tools to save the time and the headache to actually be able to get that done. You'll also notice that in my black and white film, it's not actually black and white, right? So there is a color cast to it, and we captured a color image. So if I'd like, I can go ahead and actually convert it to straight black and white. But if I want to keep that color cast for whatever informational reasons, I can do that as well. And from here, I can say, all right, let me take this image and let me give it a little bump in contrast like that. And if I take this, I take my entire roll and I just apply it there, you can see that I've got that same nice contrast in all of my areas here. And I'll also apply crop. And you can see our roll of film has been taken care of in a really nice, quick way, right? So that is kind of the gist of black and white negative. If you have Capture One Cultural Heritage, it's super, super easy. If you have, another version, it's a little bit less simple, but it can still be done. Now, color negative. This is a question that we get all the time. The reason, and again, this was the entire presentation that I gave last year. It may be online somewhere, but the reason that color negative is so hard is because if we do a direct inversion, right? First of all, the negative itself doesn't really tell us anything. And what we really want is the corresponding print, right? So if we were to put it in Enlarger and make a corresponding print, we want what we would get on the other side, right? Now, unlike black and white film, when you look at color negative film, it looks orange, right? And the reason that it looks orange is because there are layers inside the film that prevent the light that each layer is sensitive to from bleeding through into the next layer. And it just so happens that when you combine the filters that are in there, it produces that orange color. So if you do a direct inversion, you'll get an image like this, which looks really blue, right? And that makes sense because blue is the complementary color to orange. So if I flip my film around like this, and I just go ahead and do a quick crop, I'm not going to go too heavily into all of the methods that you might use to fix this. I'm sure you're aware, if you've done this yourself, that there are programs out there that are available. If you don't have Capture One, Cultural Heritage, but doing something simple like adding the curve back on there and then doing a color adjustment to account for that curve. And then we'll do a gamma adjustment here to get our image a little bit more into range. You can see it's very, very low contrast. So we'll add a lot of contrast to kind of counter that curve. And then we'll move the exposure back up, right? So you can see we're starting to get to a level of contrast that we would want. And we can introduce the sort of tone and color cast that we want to fight that blue cast that we're getting, right? And you'll see sometimes, based on the different film stock, different color casts that you get from different film stocks. And that's why it's really, there's no one size fits all solution. And what you'll find using any negative conversion software is that when it works well, it works pretty well. And when it works badly, it works really, really badly. And there's no one size fits all method for it. So Capture One gives you a lot of tools for adjusting, specific colors. Here's a version that I worked on here. This is actually Kodak Ektar. So this like red, like deep red in the leaves that you're seeing based on the exposure that I had, you can see it's actually somewhat underexposed, is actually a pretty accurate representation of what the film might look like if you tried to print it without putting like corrective filters on there. But you can account for that using the color balance tool here, right? So if my branches are a little bit too red, I can go ahead and add a little bit more green in there. Or I can specifically go in and take my color editor, and I've already gone ahead and done this, and I've corrected what originally looked like that to look much more reasonable, right? So with color negatives, you just have that additional step of finding the way to get the image to a neutral but blue-ish, and then finding a way to combat the color cast. And there's just a whole host of different ways to do that. But I think that that's kind of the gist of it. And if you want to talk more about that offline, we certainly can. And then the last type of film here that we'll talk about is, of course, transparency film. So color slides or sheet transparency film. And you can see that this is an image that I shot actually relatively recently off of the Brooklyn Heights Promenade. Those of you who know New York, that's actually backwards. But we all know that transparency film has a really, really rich amount of shadow detail. And one of the issues with shooting on a digital camera is it applies that extra curve to it, right? So for these, we actually don't want to use film standard, but we might not want to go as far as using linear, because that's going to give us a super, super flat looking image, right? We lose our highlight contrast there too. So there are a couple of other curves in here that you can take advantage of. So for most, color positive film, I like to work in film extra shadow. If I don't have a special color profile for it, and you'll see the difference between the auto, which is the film standard, and film extra shadow is pretty drastic, right? So difference between that and that, right? Because if I bring my exposure up, I know all of my detail is there, right? So you can see in here all of the individual windows. So it's just a matter of sussing that out. And if you really want to do it right, the way that you would do this is by developing a color profile specifically for a specific film stock. And that's possible because there are IT8 targets. These are scanner targets that basically look like a fancy color checker, but they're transparent and they have a bunch of different patches and different readings on them to create a color profile specifically for this camera here, which is something that we did with our friends over at National Geographic. If you're in the cultural heritage world, we've kind of beat that one to death, but it's really exciting. We built one for Kodachrome, we built one for Ektachrome, which I don't have here, and I built one for Provia, which is what this film is. And when you do that, that will actually account for the built-in contrast curve of the film. So you'll be able to work with that and not have to worry about adjusting between different curves. But yeah, oh, and then one thing that I didn't touch on, and I don't know if anybody asked a question, but white balance. When you white balance, pretty much every time you want to white balance to the light box itself, because the light box should be neutral gray. And so I always do that because we're blowing out our light box at our final images. I always do that on my LCC image because I know that's not going to be blown out. So I'll set my white balance off that in addition to setting my light uniformity. All right. So I think that that's kind of the end of what I wanted to talk about, and I will just kind of jump into the questions now, if that sounds good. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Carson, is there anything I'm missing, or are we good to jump into questions?
And are good to go into questions now.
Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to start all the way from the beginning. So folks that asked their questions way back at the beginning of the presentation, we're going to get to you. So Ronald asked, what is the major difference between phase one and commercial film scanners? And that's a great question. Primarily, you're going to have a few big differences. So one is you have an instant capture system, right? So you're not going to be sitting there waiting for your film to process. If you're using a drum scanner, that could be anywhere from minutes to dozens of minutes, maybe even hours, depending on how high res and how much material you have. The other sort of usability, ease of use thing is that you're able to use a modern computer, right? You've got USB-C going into the latest version of Capture One. If you're using a drum scanner or a virtual drum scanner, and I'm talking about those as opposed to flatbeds, because those are really the only things that can even begin to approach this quality. I know flatbed scanners can be used on modern OSs, but the image quality is very different. So the ease of use is very much there for a system like this. If you're looking at the comparison between a drum or a virtual drum scanner, it also doesn't bend the film. You don't have to fluid mount it. You don't have to do anything to it. So if I'm at a cultural heritage institution and I've got flammable film from the 1800s, I'm not going to mount that in like alcohol and just risk setting my entire building on fire or something like that. And I also don't want to damage the film by bending it or fluid mounting it or anything. So in terms of the treatment of the film, the conservation treatment, and then the ergonomics, of course, of just like using the system as an operator, it's much, much more pleasant. And then in terms of the image quality, you're capturing a raw file off of the highest dynamic range sensor currently available on the commercial market versus using, an older CCD sensor or PMTs, which were, great in the 50s and 70s. And I mean, they have a very unique rendering and they're very good at getting low light, detail out of the really dark areas of, transparency film and slide film in particular. But if you're working with a 16-bit digital back with a backside illuminated sensor, you're getting all of that and more. And the biggest difference that we see between image quality on like a really high-end, really well-done drum scan and a phase 1 scan is shadow color. A lot of times your like really high-end drum scans will give you really nice shadow detail, and they'll be very like muted in tone though. There's a lot of rich color in those shadows as well, because what you're effectively looking at in transparency film is little dye clouds, right? It's not silver, it's the dye clouds that are left behind from the coupler. And so there's always going to be color there. So if you're looking at the shadows in there and they look washed out, there should be something there, you know? So that's one of the biggest differences that I always like to bring up. But there's plenty of other things there in terms of sharpness. We use a diffuse light source, so we don't have like as crispy looking grain as like an Imicon. Somebody further down asked a question about sharpening, and I'll definitely address that. But those are just a few of the reasons. Christian asked, is there a quality difference between LED and strobe? That's a very good question. So I just mentioned that we use a diffuse light source. You can use diffusion on a strobe, but typically the light's going to be much more concentrated, and it's going to have a much less uniform spectral profile. It's going to be a lot spikier. So even if it has a really good, color rendering index, CRI, not usually something we talk about with strobes, but with an LED array that has a steady output, and that's specifically designed for color reproduction, it is going to be more stable over time. It's also just easier to use from an operational standpoint, and it's going to give you a less harsh rendition of the grain. And so using a diffuse light source, you have very soft looking grain. When you look at, and for those of you that have used Imicons and flex tights, I always describe those scans as like deep fried or crispy because they have a collimated light source, so a very, very harsh light source moving along with the sensor. And that, adds contrast to the grain. So it gives it a nice, sharp look. But the problem with adding contrast to an image is, if you have a very contrasty image, it's very hard to take that contrast out. If you have a very nice, linear image with diffuse grain, it's very easy to add sharpening and contrast in, right? But you can't take it out. So that's another big difference. And then, of course, there's the overall factor of, what is the condition of your film, right? Because you're going to be exposing it to a lot more light. You're going to be exposing it to a lot more UV. You're going to have some like blocking elements for UV, but the light output and intensity from a strobe is going to be very different as well, and that can also have an impact on your material. So that's one of the other reasons to consider, LED versus strobe. So Jenna asked a question. Are you using Schneider lenses, or I'm sorry, you're using Schneider lenses here. Are any of these lenses Rodenstock lenses? And in fact, there are also Rodenstock lenses. There is just the most gorgeous lens I've ever used in my life. It's the 105 millimeter Rodenstock HR. It's a macro lens specifically designed to work between like 0.7x. It says 0.3x, but it's not very good there. But like 0.7x, 1x to 3x. That is the sharpest lens I've ever used in my life. That's a Rodenstock lens. So it's a 105 millimeter, I think HR Digiron 5.6 floating element. Incredible. And we have those around. And if you want to, take one for a test drive or learn more about it, you can just let us know. But yeah, so Schneider and Rodenstock are pretty much the only two games in town for things that will cover a sensor this size. All right. So leveling systems, again, I mentioned the parallel. If you want to learn more about this, we'll send out some info. It's available, as a third-party thing. But we use these, and then I use, in this case, the cube leveling head. We also have a few other specifically designed options for our copy stands, and these are designed if you're using them with like book cradles or things to be much quicker adjusting. I just use the cube because it has gears as opposed to having to use Allen wrenches. So if I'm doing a demo, it's a lot quicker. But typically I would use a dedicated like DT product like this because it's going to hold much more stably when I'm shooting downward on a copy stand. Right. Recommended sharpening amount. So this is a great question. When you're looking at the amount of sharpening to use, and I'll pop back over to the screen share here. Carson, can you just confirm once again? Sorry to keep doing that.
Okay.
Great. Okay, let me pick something that's going to be a little bit grainier. Capture. Cool. Let's pick this guy. Right. So you can see that I also did not clean this very well. So I apologize for that. Trying to see, this might be Delta 100 because it's relatively fine grained. But when you look at your sharpening, there are really three different things that you can consider, right? So there's your amount, which is the intensity of your sharpening. There's your radius, which is how much around the pixel where it sees contrast are you sharpening. And I'm throwing these up just to see what would happen if it looks absolutely ungodly terrible. And then there's your threshold, which says how much contrast do I need to see in terms of levels between one pixel and the next before I apply that sharpening. So you could go anywhere from something like that to something like that, right? And that's, again, because we're using a diffuse light source, that grain is going to look nice and soft. If you want the grain to look a little bit sharper without adding too much crunch to the image, typically what I recommend is a low threshold, because typically and I'll start with the threshold. Because you're trying to pronounce the grain, so to speak, you actually want your threshold to be on the lower end, because what the threshold is going to say is if there's a little bit of difference between these two things, it's going to assume it's digital noise, right, between one pixel and the next. But in this case, that's grain, right? So we want it to be less aggressive in terms of determining what's digital noise, and because we know we have a low ISO, we're going to have low noise. Everything we see is going to be grain, right? For the amount, that's going to be the intensity of the sharpening. The radius, though, is sorry, I keep jumping all over the place, is the next thing I want to talk about. And you want to keep the radius relatively low because the grain size is relatively low as well. And so effectively, it's going to find a point where it sees contrast. It's going to say, okay, I'm going to sharpen, in a radius around that, area. And then I'm going to apply a certain amount. So usually what I recommend is setting a low threshold, setting a radius of 1 or less, and then increasing the amount to kind of determine how much grain you want pronounced. Typical Imicon settings that we've looked at trying to match are around 300, like 1.3 and then 0.8, I think. So you can see that this is where things would start to look a little bit crispier versus going all the way off. And you never want to have sharpening all the way off. Some people are like, oh, well, why would I want to add sharpening? It's, it's because you want to pronounce that detail in your image. If it's a linear, diffusely lit image, it's just going to look flat and soft. So you do want to add some of that, but you don't want to go too hard on it. Or maybe you do, but that's kind of how I recommend playing around with the sharpening. And like I said, I think the Imicons go a little bit crispy. So I would never go higher than that, typically. Okay. Jeff asks, do you want to use, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Do you want to use negative mode and not photography mode? Yes, if you have it. If you don't have it, if you're not using Capture One Cultural Heritage, you can still get the job done. It's just harder. And that's why if you're working with large batches of things, Capture One Cultural Heritage and using any kind of hardware or software that's dedicated for that purpose is really going to save you time in the long run. The other thing I'll add is if you have somebody who is already using this gear, like the folks over at Pixel Acuity, you can get the same results by letting them do the job for you. So if you have something like that going on where you have a large project you want to work on, we can always help with that as well, now that we have that ability to offer services. All right, Steve is asking, is there any advantage to using dual exposure plus on the IQ4 150? That is a great question. So dual exposure plus, I actually haven't tried. What I have tried though is frame averaging. And if you have really, really, really dense film, right? So something that's super overexposed. There's a really good sample of like Kodak film that we have around here that's like a test for that specifically, like busting through grain. And if you do frame averaging, and I imagine dual exposure plus would be the same thing, you can drive the noise down so low that you can boost an image by like 8 stops and still get shadow contrast without introducing noise. So you can actually use, some of these computational imaging tools in the IQ4, frame averaging, dual exposure plus, to really cut through thick film is usually the place where I would recommend using it if you're going to do that. 9 times out of 10, you don't need to, and you won't really see any advantage out of it. It'll just take longer and be a little bit more difficult to maintain stability over that period of time. But there's certainly cases where you can take advantage of that. Right. Good question. If your film holder is not full frame, how do you avoid or compensate for the vignette? That's a great question. The answer is black cardboard. You can cut your own mask out of it. We sometimes have really weird film sizes that we do. Sometimes, when we're doing contact sheets, we need something to mask off the edges, and that's just where you get, a solid piece of matte board and you make your own mask for it. So totally just, DIY. Sometimes you do have to do that stuff. Right. Okay. Do you ever use anti-Newton glass to keep your film flat? The answer is absolutely. I think one of our techs took it with him, but for those of you who aren't aware, anti-Newton ring glass is glass that's designed to eliminate these colored fringe rings that you get when you have air gaps essentially in between your film and your glass that just like totally mess up your images and make them look awful. And so we do use that to keep film flat when we're working at very high magnification. So I have shot some film at 13,000 PPI. It was a miserable experience for everyone, but I absolutely had to use the anti-Newton ring glass for that. And then the other case where you might want to use it is if you're using larger sheet film, 5x7, where we don't have like a holder for that specifically, 8x10, that's perfect for the film carrier. And if for some reason you want to fluid mount, we have some people that come from the drum scanner world that just really want to do that. You can actually use the anti-Newton ring glass carrier to fluid mount. So that's another option. Okay. Is there any way to emulate the film positive and negative curves in Capture One Pro? The answer is sort of, but not really. Like kind of what I showed you, doing the inversion, coming up with the contrast curve, like you can kind of make it work, but if you're really trying to get this done in a like fundamental way, it's better to just go with Capture One cultural heritage. Yes, invert. So what I showed was a preset, but basically when I clicked invert on the levels, it's just taking the white point and the black point and flipping them. So yes, that's a good question. Thank you, Jennifer. Tim is asking, is there a good reason to preserve an RGB file for black and white negative? The answer is maybe for preservation purposes. If you capture a specific emulsion where it's skewed really, green or really purple or something, then you'd at least keep that information in there. Obviously, when you invert it, it'll go to the opposite color, but you can always invert it back and see what the initial film looked like. In terms of presentation, almost never. I don't really think there would ever be a case where you'd want to preserve that RGB color, but it's possible. Lou is asking, so you're essentially post-processing the color negative film by eye. And the answer to that is absolutely. When you're looking at working with film in an Enlarger, color negative film, you're dropping it in there, you're getting your color filters set to where they are. You're printing your image onto the paper, determining the exposure time, right? And you have the matching receiver paper, which is that blue to the corresponding orange. If you've ever been terrible in the darkroom and actually taken the paper out and looked at it before it was exposed, it is literally blue. But yeah, I mean, it's the same thing that you would have to do. And this is why it's so tough, right? There's no right answer, because if I give the color negative film to one analog printer and then to another analog printer, they could give me 2 prints that look great, but differ subtly because they use different enlargers, different color filters, different settings on those filters. So you want to make sure you're using a really, really good color calibrated monitor. I never do any of my film color correction work on, a laptop or something like that. I'm always using one of the studio ASOs, just because I know it's going to have the right color, calibration to output my images when I do print them. So the answer to color negative film is there's no one right answer. There are things that are closer or further to what a certain emulsion should look like based on the receiver paper, but everybody is going to come up with their own interpretations of a negative because you're effectively looking for the corresponding print. All right, Rufus is asking, what did we use to make our Provia profile and the National Geographic Society ones? I'm going to start going through these quickly because we have more questions come in faster than I can answer them. We used IT8 targets made by either Kodak or Fuji. They're available out there. Mode between photography and film positive just changes what it does with the highlights. If you have Capture One cultural heritage, you can play around with it. 9 times out of 10, you don't really need to use them. Someone is asking, if the film is really badly curled, would you ever use focus stacking? Absolutely not. No. You would do what you can to try and flatten the film safely. If you can't do that, that's when you send it back to your conservation department and say, hey, we can't image this as it is. Let us know what you want us to do. But focus stacking, especially at that magnification, when there's really, you're looking at like grains of contrast, it's going to be a disaster. And it's not going to really tell you anything about the image content. So if you want to document this condition, I would just take a positive image of it. If you want to try and capture the actual film content, I would find some way to flatten it and talk to my conservation department about that. All right. Okay, let's see. Okay, I think we just got a few more, and then we'll cut it after that. Are there any known issues using ES mode over LS mode when capturing? Is one preferred over the other, and why? So that's a great question. If you're using strobes, you can't use electronic shutter, or if you do, you have to limit your exposure to a really, really long time. And that's going to cause a huge amount of problems if you have any light leaks at all. Typically, you want to use a leaf shutter. A leaf shutter is preferable to a focal plane shutter because the vibration is just lower. Of course, an electronic shutter has no vibration, but the inbuilt vibration of the system can cause waviness, which is something that you obviously need to keep for scanners that are actually physically scanning. Is another issue that you have to account for, is the stability of that, machine vibration-wise. That said, having used the 105 Rodenstock lens that I was talking about with the IQ4 150 backs with the electronic shutter, since it doesn't have a shutter in it, works relatively well as long as you're able to maintain a vibration-free environment, and as long as your light source and you have anti-flickering set up with your light source, or your LED is set so that you don't need that. But that lattermost thing will be very obvious if it's a problem. All right. What color profile do you recommend using for black and white images? 9 times out of 10, I'm just going to use the camera that I'm using. So in this case, the Phase 1 IXH, flat art reproduction, flash flat art reproduction. You can make custom color profiles for it, but typically, because you're just looking at tonal information, I just want the standard tonal response of the sensor in that case. And the last question here. Daniel's asking, what is the speed of digitization with the IXG or IXH and Capture One CH in real life projects? How many 35mm frames can be captured per hour by 2 people? I'm glad you said 2 people, because that means that one person is handling the film and the other person is capturing. Handling the material is always what takes the longest amount of time. The capture itself, as you saw, is like hit a button and you're done. So that is really your limiting factor. If you have someone that's loading them as fast as you can shoot them, you know, you could easily do, I would say, 400 or 500, maybe even per hour. Assuming everything is like ready to go. You know, if you have to take things in and out of envelopes, if you have to, you know, be careful like mounting things because they're edges or sprockets or things, you know, all of that will slow you down. But from a pure capture standpoint, you can definitely get up there. So I think that that's all we have time for. But hopefully this was interesting, informative. You know, hopefully you guys learned something. If you have any questions, my contact information is available. I can just, yeah, you can send it to info at Digital Transitions, and we'll get a reply back to you. But other than that, thank you so much for joining us, and keep shooting film, and we hope to see you again.